My stepmother was my lifeline until she asked me to give up my fiancé to save my sister. I'm a 25-year-old woman who has been living with my stepmother, Mary, since I was 5. Mary is 45 now, but she's been in my life as long as I can remember. My early childhood was extremely difficult. My biological mother was an alcoholic and very abusive toward me. Her neglect and erratic behavior led my dad to file for divorce and fight for full custody. Sadly, her issues couldn't be fully proven in court, so custody was split, and I spent most of my time with her. That arrangement didn't last long. One day, she left me home alone, and I accidentally accessed the balcony. My neighbors noticed this and called Child Protective Services. And from then on, I began living with my dad. Initially things were rough, but everything improved when my dad met Mary. She was his assistant during the divorce, and they began a relationship soon after. Mary, who was also divorced, had a daughter named Jane, who was 2 years younger than me. Jane had a neurological condition that confined her to a wheelchair. I met Mary and Jane when I was 4. At first, I was hesitant and guarded because of the trauma I'd experienced with my biological mother. Mary, however, was incredibly patient. She gave me the space and time I needed to trust her, and within weeks I felt comfortable with both her and Jane. We became very close. Not long after, my dad and Mary decided to get married. Their wedding was small and intimate, with just my grandparents and Mary's parents in attendance. I used to call her Mary before the wedding, but ever since then, I've called her Mom because, even though she didn't legally adopt me, I've always seen her as a mother, an adoptive mother. From that point, our lives steadily improved. Mary opened her own law practice, and my dad, a construction worker, started his own construction company. Soon, his business flourished, and from then on, we never faced another day of hardship. Both Jane and I went to the best schools and had good lives. I always considered Jane my sister, helping her with whatever she needed and standing up for her whenever necessary. Mary felt like the only mother I had ever had since childhood because she was always there for me. I've been extremely grateful to her my entire life because she's the reason I'm alive and thriving, and I've never stopped showing her my gratitude. We moved to a much better neighborhood when I started high school, and that's where I met my boyfriend, Ryan. Ryan lived 2 blocks away and was my classmate. We started walking to school together once we realized we lived in the same area and became good friends. He used to visit my house often and got along well with everyone, especially Jane. He was one of the few people she felt comfortable around, and we all had a lot of fun together. At the end of last year, he asked me out, and I said yes. When I told my family about it, everyone seemed happy, except Jane. From that day on, Jane frequently became irritated with me, and we didn't talk much. Mary noticed Jane's behavior and attributed it to a recent change in her medication. I understood and decided not to talk to her much to avoid fights and reduce her stress. So, Ryan and I applied to many universities and were fortunate to get into the same one, which was a pretty good school. Everyone was thrilled with our achievement, and Ryan and I couldn't have been happier. Jane remained somewhat distant from me, so I decided to talk to her before leaving and clear the air, because after all, she was family. After talking for hours, I realized from the way she spoke about Ryan that she had a crush on him. It all made sense, but I wasn't going to leave my boyfriend to fix things, so I decided not to bring up the topic at all. Jane and I reached an understanding before I left, and I was satisfied with that. Before leaving, I told Mary the first thought Jane had a crush on Ryan and that it would be helpful if she talked to Jane to prevent further problems between us. She assured me she would handle it and told me I could always count on her support. I got emotional about leaving my mom, and we both cried a bit in the kitchen. A few weeks after that conversation, I left with Ryan to settle into our room at the university. The next 4 years were great academically. I learned a lot, excelled in most subjects, and secured some internships ahead of my peers. Overall, I was doing well. On the other hand, my relationship with Ryan wasn't at its best. We'd had issues from the start of college and were on and off most of the time. I also heard some rumors that he had cheated on me, so by the end of college, our relationship was pretty shaky. Given our history, we mutually decided that we should take a break for a while to get our bearings. I came home to rest for a few months after finishing my degree and told my parents about the breakup. They weren't as surprised as I thought, but that didn't seem strange to me. Jane was also about to finish high school and asked if I could get Ryan to talk to her because she was planning to study the same field and needed guidance. I was hesitant to call Ryan so soon after our breakup and suggested some of my friends from the same field, but she insisted she only wanted to talk to Ryan. So, I decided to put my feelings aside for Jane and texted him. After speaking with her, Ryan called me and told me Jane had been flirting with him during the call and that he wasn't interested in her in that way. I told Mary, and she said it shouldn't be an issue for me because Ryan and I had broken up. I didn't think much about it after that. A few years later, Jane was about to finish college, and I was working while still living at my parents' house. I ran into Ryan while grocery shopping. He was doing well, established, and enjoying life. We started chatting and met up several times for lunches and breakfasts. Eventually, we rekindled our relationship, and a few months later, he proposed, to which I obviously said yes. The news of our relationship wasn't received as we expected by Mary, and Jane's anger was understandable. However, it was the news of our engagement that caused turmoil in my home. Jane had a major tantrum, which led to an anxiety attack, and she had to be rushed to the emergency room. She was fine, but due to her predispositions, the doctors advised us to take good care of her and avoid introducing stress. After discussing it with Mary and my dad, we decided that the best course of action was for me to move out. I moved shortly after the incident and would visit home on weekends. Jane had now accepted my engagement and was quite excited about the wedding. Initially, she was going to be my maid of honor, but after her reaction to the engagement, I decided to leave her as one of the guests instead. Everything was going well with everyone, especially Mary, who was trying to involve herself in every little detail of my wedding and was also paying for half the expenses. I couldn't have been more grateful to her for everything and even mentioned it in my speech during the rehearsal dinner. 2 days before my wedding, on the night of the rehearsal dinner, everyone was drunk beyond reason, and Mary asked to speak with me privately. I thought it would be a mother-daughter conversation, so I suggested we talk in my room. I didn't expect what was about to happen. Mary sat me down and started talking about how grateful she was to have a daughter like me, which made me emotional. She went on to say she had similar hopes for Jane, but that it was very difficult, and she began to cry. I consoled her, and she asked me if I loved her. I said yes. Then she asked me if I owed her my life. It was an absurd question, but I answered yes again. Hearing this, she stood up and asked me for a favor. When I asked her what it was, she said that since I owed her everything I had, she wanted me to share a bit of it with my sister Jane. I was confused and asked what she wanted me to share. What she said next was far from normal. She said that compared to Jane, I had a much better life, while Jane was surrounded by only a few people, one of whom was Ryan. She claimed that she had known about Jane's attraction to Ryan since childhood, but hadn't done anything about it until we broke up after college. She continued, saying Ryan was a very understanding man, and perfect for Jane. She asked me to break off my engagement with Ryan and convince him to marry Jane instead. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and told her to stop, but she didn't. She said this was the only way I could repay her since she had accepted me as her own blood and cared for me as her own daughter. She said she wanted Jane to have a relationship for her future too, and Ryan was the only man she was certain wouldn't break her daughter's heart. She knew Ryan wasn't interested in Jane that way, which is why she wanted me to convince him. I couldn't process what was happening, and in a fit of rage, I kicked her out of my room while she shouted that I should consider it, and that she would be indebted to me for life if I did this for her daughter. Her shouting attracted some attention, and my dad came to ask what was going on. I didn't answer, and simply left him and Mary outside. I cried in my room and didn't realize when I fell asleep. The next day, I woke up late, and my dad asked me to see him in his room. Mary was there, her eyes swollen from crying. He said what I did the previous night wasn't right, and treating Mary, the woman who raised me, that way and throwing her out wasn't something I should have done. I realized then that he didn't know anything about what Mary had asked me. When I was about to tell him, Mary grabbed my hand tightly, signaling me not to reveal the truth. I pulled my hand away, and before I could say anything, we heard a scream from Jane's room. She had fallen in the bathroom and had cuts on her legs. We didn't have enough first aid supplies, so my dad decided to take her to the emergency room immediately, and discuss the issue with me and Mary later. Since then, Mary has been begging me not to tell my dad the truth, and to avoid damaging their relationship. I don't want to have a conversation with her and have been staying in my room. Am I a bad person if I don't give Mary another chance to explain or apologize before telling my dad what she asked of me? Update 1. Thank you for such kind responses. Initially, I realized Mary was in the wrong, but I started doubting myself after my dad tried to intervene. I've decided to follow the advice from the comments, and will talk to Ryan first before speaking to my dad. Some have wondered why I wasn't aware of Mary's intentions earlier, considering I knew Jane had a crush on Ryan. The thing is, everyone, including Ryan, thought it was just an innocent crush, and nothing more. There was never a moment when Ryan had reciprocated Jane's feelings with actions or words. However, I think I should have been more careful with the signs. One thing that now seems odd is that during the dress shopping, Mary also decided to buy Jane a wedding dress to fulfill her wish of seeing both her daughters in bridal gowns. This could have been due to the difficulty Jane might face in finding a husband because of her condition and people's prejudices. Jane was fine with some cuts on her legs, which were taken care of. She didn't know anything about what Mary had asked of me, and honestly, I didn't know how she would react if she found out. When I went to check on Jane after she came back, I saw Mary in a corner, her face turning pale as soon as I called my dad. I had to ask for the car keys to meet Ryan. Mary broke down on the spot, likely thinking I might expose her, so I helped her get to the bed. My dad decided to stay by her side, silently blaming her condition on me. I didn't have time to explain anything and left immediately after grabbing the car keys. I'm writing this part after meeting Ryan. I went and asked him to meet me in the car to avoid unwanted attention. He realized from my voice that it was something serious and rushed down. I told him everything that had happened the previous night, and let him know that Jane's crush on him might not have been so small after all. He was more shocked than I was, because he had always respected Mary greatly for being such an excellent woman and a loving mother to me. He said such a revelation would lead to many problems, so the best option would be to postpone the wedding for a few weeks. He made it very clear that no matter what, he's on my side, and is willing to elope if that's what it takes to be with me. He wanted to be there while I told my dad about this, but I asked him not to since it was a family matter first. He agreed and asked me to call him immediately after I finished talking to my dad. He would announce to the guests that the wedding was postponed due to some personal issues. Although I am happy to have someone like Ryan by my side, I am still scared because this situation could lead to strained relations with my dad, who has always been there for me since day one. I already lost a mother yesterday, and I'm not prepared to lose a father too. Update 2: A lot has happened since the last update. I gathered all the courage I could and went back to tell my dad the truth. Mary opened the door and let me in, but she didn't seem as stressed as before. I entered the room and saw my dad sitting on the bed with Jane lying down. He seemed angry and asked me to sit. He told me he knew what had happened the night before and was extremely disappointed in me. I asked him what he was talking about, and he said Mary had informed him that I reprimanded her the previous night, saying she wasn't my real mother and Jane wasn't family, so I didn't want them at the wedding. According to my dad, when Mary tried to calm me down, I told her I didn't want her disabled daughter ruining the wedding photos. I couldn't believe how manipulative Mary was. I tried to tell my dad the truth about Mary, which surprised him, but he said this was a case of my word against Mary's, and there was no way he could believe one version over the other, so perhaps we should resolve it for now. Jane was constantly saying that her mom's side of the story was correct, and now I was sure Mary had told Jane the truth and asked her to act. I made it very clear to my dad that the wedding was postponed because I didn't care who thought which side was true. It was absolutely unacceptable for me to have someone who had emotionally manipulated me into giving up the love of my life. Mary quickly intervened, saying she wanted to apologize if she had done anything wrong while raising me and hoped our relationship could have a second chance, with them being part of my wedding. My dad also insisted that I should move on and let the wedding happen without issues, since so much money had been spent, but I decided not to heed their requests and left that same day. I went to Ryan's house, and it's been 2 days since then. I honestly didn't have the energy to deal with anything, so I turned off my social media accounts. So far, I haven't been contacted by my dad or Mary, but I've received calls from some relatives, which I didn't answer, assuming they were about the wedding cancellation. Things are quite stressful right now, and I hope to find a way to resolve them soon. Update 3. This update comes a week after the last one when the wedding was postponed, and I moved out of my parents' house. A week of constant calls later, I heard from Ryan, who is friends with my dad on Facebook. Apparently, my dad had posted something on his wall about me. After our relatives tried to figure out the reason for the wedding cancellation and got no answers, they decided to press my dad and Mary about it. They tried to contact me to make a public announcement as a family, but since they couldn't reach me, my dad made that post on Facebook. In the post, he mentioned how he, Mary and Jane were begging me not to ruin their reputation over minor family issues, and hoped I would respond since talking was the only way to resolve this. This post caused even more damage to the already complicated situation. Our relatives and all of their friends on Facebook were now speculating about the problem and spreading rumors. The worst rumor I heard was that I had stolen money for the wedding and then cheated on Ryan. Ryan was getting stressed about all of this, and I talked to him, thinking he might be having doubts, but to my surprise, he reassured me once again that he was going to marry me no matter what came our way. I still hadn't responded to the Facebook post, and planned to speak to my next day to at least be rational before the big confrontation. However, things took a different turn. That same night, I received a call from my grandmother, my biological mother's mom. I hadn't mentioned her before because she wasn't directly involved in the incident, but she has been an important part of my life. She has always protected me and shielded me from my mother, and even helped my dad financially. She usually doesn't get involved in our issues, but her intervention in this incident meant something big had happened. Apparently, she had learned everything, and directly confronted my dad about it. He told her what he believed to be true, Mary's version. My grandmother trusted me and felt something was off, so she decided to talk to me about it. She knew how much I loved Mary and Jane, and couldn't believe I would have thought they weren't family. I got emotional thinking that someone in my family finally believed my version and told her everything. She said she couldn't believe how vile Mary was, and how I had saved myself from her malicious intentions. I told her how I feared losing my dad, and she asked me to talk to my parents first while she tried to find a solution. The next day, I decided to go back to my house and talk to my parents. I was blamed over and over again for making a spectacle of our family. Honestly, I was exhausted by them in just a few minutes, and asked if I could have a moment alone with Mary. We went to another room, and I asked her why she was doing this to me when I had loved her my entire life. Before you ask why I didn't record the conversation, my phone had fallen, and the screen was broken, and I still hadn't replaced it. I couldn't borrow Ryan's phone either, since he uses it for work. Plus, I didn't expect Mary to confess anything. But back to the case, she said what she had said was something she had been feeling, and never wanted to burden me with it. She asked me to forget it as a mistake and move on. I said her loss of control, which she justified by alcohol, and her excessive requests were unacceptable under any concept, and I would stand by the truth no matter what, which led Mary to warn me about the consequences. Hearing this, I went out and asked my dad one last time if he was even willing to believe my version of what Mary had asked me. He said what I was accusing Mary of was very serious, and that it wasn't possible for him to believe something so vile, especially from the woman he had loved for so many years. Anyway, I already had my answer and furiously left their house. The next thing I heard was that they were telling people I had abandoned them, so they were cutting off contact with me as well. I've been talking to my grandmother, so Ryan and I will visit her at her country house this weekend. Update 4. I'll start this update with good news. Once Ryan and I arrived at my grandmother's beautiful house, she suggested that, since my parents had created this situation, we should consider eloping and getting married in her garden instead of having the original wedding. Ryan thought it was a great idea, and called his parents to ask for their permission. They were very happy with our decision, so the next day, my grandmother called her local priest, and Ryan and I got married. He announced the news to everyone through his Facebook. The post received some comments, but we decided to check them once we got back home. My dad and Mary also saw the post and recognized the background, so they started bombarding my grandmother's phone with calls and messages. My grandmother responded, reminding them that they were the ones who started speaking ill of me, so they shouldn't be surprised now. She ended the conversation after that. After the event, I told my grandmother what had happened at my parents' house, and asked if she had any plans. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her very clearly that after Mary's supposed threat, I wanted to expose her in front of my dad. Assuming Jane already knew what her mother was plotting, my grandmother then revealed her plan. She said she had a considerable amount of money from her divorce years ago, and would use it to claim she was giving it to me, to start a new life after my parents had abandoned me. In her judgment, she was sure my dad and Mary would want a piece of the money, and she would pretend to give it to them if Mary confessed. Since I had nothing to lose after marrying the man I loved and having a family with my grandmother, I decided to give this a chance. The next day, my grandmother called my dad and informed him that she was going to give me her money because they had cut contact with me. Just as she expected, they were surprised and wanted to talk in person. So, the next afternoon, my dad, Mary, and Jane came to my grandmother's house. They congratulated Ryan and me, but nothing more happened after that. Mary asked to speak with me privately. She started by talking about how my life was finally at peace with my marriage and all this new money. I asked her what the purpose of the private conversation was, because I didn't want to interact with her unnecessarily. She said what she had done that night was extremely inappropriate. I asked her to clarify what she had done, because I wanted her to feel ashamed for ruining my relationship with my dad and Jane. She explicitly apologized for asking me to leave Ryan and convince him to marry Jane instead. She went on to say that it was all her maternal instinct and that was why we were having this conversation. And yes, this time I was prepared and was able to record it, though I ultimately didn't need the recording. I expected her to say something along the lines of how I was also her daughter, that she felt regretful and wanted to make amends by telling the truth. Instead, she told me the money I now had could help Jane establish herself and have a better future. I didn't interrupt her and let her continue. She kept trying to convince me to give half of the money to Jane because I could earn more while life was already harder for Jane. Now, with the love of her life married to me, this was the least I could do for her. I didn't say anything and started looking at the kitchen door behind her. I don't know how, but it must have been God's will that halfway through the conversation, my dad had come to find us and decided to stay silent and listen to what Mary was saying. She didn't realize he was right behind her because she was too busy explaining herself. As soon as I looked at my dad after she finished, she realized he had been there the whole time and the big mistake she had made. Mary tried to cover up what she had said during the conversation and instead revealed much more about how she had known about all this for some time and was doing it all for Jane. My dad immediately called Jane and asked if she knew about all of this. Seeing the stressful situation, she realized it was better to tell the truth. My dad turned to me and began apologizing for not believing me in the first place. He told Mary and Jane to leave the house as soon as they could the next day because he had a lot to think about. Mary tried to plead, citing Jane's condition, but my dad wasn't willing to listen to anything. I asked my dad to go rest in his room because it was a lot to process. Ryan accompanied him, while Mary and Jane decided to stay in another room until they left. Nobody offered them any sympathy, and we could see that Mary had seen this coming. I cried that night, thinking about how bad things had gotten and how we'd been a happy family just months ago. Ryan comforted me, saying he would be my real family from now on. The next day, Mary and Jane left, and my dad left 2 days later after apologizing profusely for not trusting me in the first place. I told him his doubts about me could have damaged our relationship and that we should take things slow moving forward. He seemed disheartened but agreed to give me some space. Ryan and I also left that same day, thanking my grandmother for everything she had done for me. I asked her to come stay at my house for a while, and she might visit us next summer. Since many of you have been asking about what happened with my dad and Mary, here I am writing this update 4 months later. My dad decided to divorce Mary, but still wanted to stay in Jane's life if she wanted. However, Jane didn't want anything to do with him, partly because Mary had told her not to be in my dad's life if they divorced, because it would be too painful for her. Which speaks to Mary's vile nature. If she couldn't have my dad, no one else could in any way. Mary tried her hardest to win my dad back, but failed. Despite her efforts, my dad stood firm in his decision. Mary never apologized to me for everything she put me through. Her justification was that everything she did was for her daughter, so in her mind, it was somehow acceptable. I just felt relieved that I no longer had to deal with her. Ryan and I are doing well and focusing on building our new life together. We are settling into our routine, and are grateful for my grandmother's support, who remains a wonderful presence in our lives. And to clarify something, my grandmother didn't give us the money, that was just for the ruse. My grandmother isn't planning to put me in her will, at least as far as I know.